the inaugural edition of Around the Desk from Decision Desk HQ. I'm Drew McCoy. I'm joined by the DDHQ analysis team that many of you have spent the last couple of election nights with. We thought we would take the show not quite on the road, but to the daylight hours. Scott Tranter's with us, Alex Al Dunstan, and Alex Podcool is with us. Plus, we have a very special guest because we're going to be wrapping up Louisiana. If Louisiana were still French and still had a king, J. Miles Coleman would be the king of Louisiana elections. So we're thrilled to have him with us. Hey, guys, how you all doing today?
Good. J. Miles, I got to say, I assume you had the most fun you've had in a while Saturday night looking around Louisiana stuff?
Oh, yeah, it was definitely something else. You know, it was one of those, like most election nights, you're kind of tired, but I know that adrenaline just kind of keeps you up. Okay, I want to see how exactly Edwards won. Where did he do great? Where did he do okay? So, it was a lot to take again, but definitely a fun night.
It might be a little out of order, but you over at Crystal Ball, I believe a day or two before the election, moved it over to lean Democratic. Is that correct?
Yeah. So basically kind of what our thinking there was, we kind of have a policy where, we don't, at the end of a race, we don't want to still have this toss up. So we were kind of looking at which way to move it. And we noticed during the primary last month, Edwards really wasn't getting too great of a black vote in the early vote. And there was this kind of narrative that a lot of national Democrats were pushing. Okay, well, he's going to get, over 50%. He's going to win outright. The data just wasn't there. So that's why, he did eventually wind up under 50. But this time it was something of the opposite of that. Edwards had a really strong black turnout during basically in Louisiana, our early vote period is a week, and every day he would just be way above his marks in terms of the early vote, just running circles around Rasponi's people. And what I've noticed is watching the state for several cycles, when the Democrats' backs are up against the wall, they can turn out their vote there. And that's exactly what happened. Now, granted, we can get into some of this later. We did see some type of national trends happening there. Edwards did improve in many suburban areas, but the black vote, which is really the heart and soul of his coalition, showed up for him. So we kind of picked up on that, and that's basically why we shifted it over to Lean's Dem.
So you were ahead of it, even though all the polling, I shouldn't say ahead of it, you were just more correct than some of the polling had it where Rasponi was ahead and or it was completely tied. One of the things we want to do is you've been great about breaking down the mapping and analysis of everything.
Yes.
And so we're going to pull up some of your tweets. You can walk us through of what this meant and what you've seen. So let's pull the first one up there, Austin. Hopefully everyone can see it. Yeah, talk us through what you saw here and why this was interesting.
So what's I can't actually see it right now. Which slide are we talking about? I'm sorry.
Oh, all right. Let's figure this out. Hopefully you can see it, right? Louisiana runoff showed how red most of the bayou has become. The coastal parts of. I'm gonna butcher your name, Terrebonne and Lafourche.
That's actually Lafourche. So basically what I was trying to get at with this one is, we talk a lot about how, like anywhere else, the urban areas are trending bluer. But if you look at some of the areas along the coast, like Acadiana, these two, I thought this pair of parishes was instructive because the southern parts of Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes used to be safe for a type of Democrat like John Bell Edwards, Mary Landrieu even. And if you look at these two, I didn't include the map in this specific one, but if you look at how Mary Landrieu did there in 2014, she lost them by about the same margin Edwards did last time. So what I was kind of showing you there is kind of how some other, compared to an election like the 2014 Senate race, some parts of the state have moved bluer, but some of the redder parts really haven't come along.
Gotcha. Okay, that's pretty interesting. Can we go on to the next slide? Break it down a little bit more for us.
Okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
So yeah, basically with this one, what I was showing is turnout was across the board, was up basically everywhere across the board. Edwards, he only was generally up slightly. He only really outright lost votes in Acadiana and kind of the southwestern part of the state, which which I would, as I often describe on Twitter, it's basically the most ancestrally Democratic part of the state. He actually lost votes in a lot of the purple parishes in the southwestern part of the state. Now, you look at Eddie Rispone, how he did in terms of raw votes compared to David Vitter. There was this kind of area on that map on the right where a lot of those parishes are the darkest shade of gold, meaning he got, a pretty good vote increase over David Vitter last time. There were a few parishes of Loyal Evangeline, which are, have pretty historically been friendly to blue dogs like Edwards. Rispone was able to double the number of raw votes that David Vitter got in these parishes. So I think that what we saw with Edwards in 2015, in some of these parishes, he was able to kind of briefly bring back into the Democratic fold, but as the electorate expands, as we cast more votes, some of these areas take on more of a presidential type of character, which I think helped Rispone in a lot of these rural areas.
Gotcha. Are you going to say, Podcool?
Well, no, I just had a question for Miles. I know Louisiana doesn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't release early vote or ABEV count by precinct, only by parish. Is that correct?
They're doing some. I think with this last cycle, they just started to do it down to the precinct level. The reason why I haven't really got into it at that level is it's still somewhat of a pain in the butt because they release it by precinct, but it'll be of a PDF of every parish. So it's if especially if they're updated every day, it's a little bit of a pain to have to go in and convert all of these PDFs. Now, if they did it in if they had a type of Excel sheet, I would probably look more into that. But short answer is, yeah, they just started to, but it's not in a great format.
Got it. Are there any major lessons that we should be able to draw from some of the ABEV vote? Because I know at the top you were kind of discussing comparing it to earlier years, and I'm just wondering how 2019 looked compared to other ABEV votes in Louisiana.
Yeah, it's what one of the things I thought was interesting is that it was somewhat of a reversal from 2015 because Edwards in 2015, he got 56 overall. In the early vote, he got close to 60. On election day, he got 54, so they kind of averaged out. This time, Edwards actually did better on election day. He got about 50.9% of the early vote, if I'm remembering that correctly. And on election day, he got 51.3 or something like that. So I think, I thought that was an interesting kind of, maybe as early vote, this was 2019 saw the highest non-presidential amount of early voting in the state's history. And maybe as early voting becomes more popular, it'll perhaps mirror the election day breakdown more and more.
Makes sense. Moving on to the next slide.
Okay, yeah.
You want to break down this one for us? Yeah.
Yes. So basically, this is East Jefferson Parish. This is basically the area where I kind of grew up. And what's funny to me is, like, historically, this was the when the Republicans first started becoming competitive in Louisiana back in the 70s, 80s. This was like their base region. East Jefferson Parish specifically has the large suburb of Metairie. This has, it's given us some pretty high-profile national politicians like Steve Scalise is from here, David Vader is from here. So historically, this has been the kind of launching pad for a lot of statewide Republicans. And now in these contested statewide races, it's basically a swing region. Now, granted, the generic Democrat isn't going to do as well as Edwards did here, but I thought that these types of shifts here were very telling. In 2008, Mary Landrieu got 44% of the vote here, and that was, at the time, for a Democrat, that was like amazing. She had a big kind of bump there because of the work she did on Hurricane Katrina, the recovery efforts there. So she got a lot of good press around that. But even with that kind of extra bump there, she still lost it by 10 points. So I thought it was very telling that Risponi held it, but it was basically a tie.
Actually, that's a good place that I'd like to jump in, because we want to keep this to a half an hour or so.
Sure.
We talked about John Bel Edwards not necessarily being your average Democrat, certainly a good fit Louisiana, but that brings us to the other Democrats, and actually John Bel Edwards got name checked last night. So we want to take a few minutes to talk about last night's Democratic debate and the polling as far as the state of the Democratic primary race is right now. So did everybody watch the debate last night? Anybody have some urgent thoughts? It seemed sort of a little more status quo than some of the other ones. I don't know if there was a huge moment that some of the other debates
Drew,
had.
I'm curious, real quick, who won, in your opinion? Quick,
Joe
one
Biden.
word. Joe Biden. Podcool, who won?
Mayor Pete.
Okay. Jay Miles, who won?
I'm going to say Amy Klobuchar. I thought she had a decent night there.
Gotcha. Al Dunson.
Whoever the media decides to talk about for the next week. Which,
All right, Al Dunson's just angry at the world. Obviously, Yang Gang won. Clear win. Yang media blackout. Okay. So based on that, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the RCP average now, but what's the breakdown? Is there any, this includes some of the stuff, I know some people are doing overnight stuff, which is methodologically interesting, but in there, right? Or no?
I don't think so.
Who looks at
it
this?
would
Al
be,
Dunson,
it would
what are we
be
looking at here?
anything. It would be anything that RCP has included as of this morning, which probably doesn't include that stuff. So yeah, I mean, these are the averages as of today for the national, and then some of the early states. Shout out to John Ralston, Nevada made it. And so, Biden still leads, as he has been this entire time, at the national level. But interestingly, Iowa, New Hampshire are getting, Warren took a lead in Iowa a little while ago. Now Buttigieg has taken that lead. you see that it's a 4-man race, 4-man and women race there, with Biden, Sanders, Warren, and Buttigieg, and everyone else is sort of lagging behind. And I'm not sure if anyone else will be able to sort of clear that 15% threshold. New Hampshire, sort of the same story. There's a logjam at the top, and there's not a real clear front runner. And then Nevada and South Carolina, a little bit less of that story. You do see the Biden lead persist there. Bottom right, you also have betting odds. And so, I mean, Warren a few weeks ago was sort of the dead-on favorite, even though she didn't really have a lead anywhere outside of maybe Iowa and New Hampshire. And that has now sort of plummeted down.
So I'm curious, who around, based on what everyone said, who thinks Biden is still going to win South Carolina, assuming, which it won't happen, assuming who's leading now? So assuming Buttigieg wins Iowa, Warren wins New Hampshire, Biden wins Nevada. If those three happen, as the polling does now, which it won't, but let's assume it does Biden still win South Carolina?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
If Biden can win Nevada, then he would win South Carolina. Yeah.
So the consensus is Biden can come in fourth in Iowa, still maintain top 3 in New Hampshire, and then still ride those not first place finishes to first in Nevada and South Carolina?
I think that's a little different than your question. You were saying, assuming Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada happens, will South Carolina happen? I think if Biden actually comes in fourth in Iowa, I don't see how he could come in first in Nevada.
But that's my point is do we don't think this is the order now, right? We don't think Iowa's going to go the way it is, New Hampshire's going to go the way it is, Nevada's going to go the way it is, or South Carolina, as these polls describe, correct?
No,
Probably not. But I mean, if it does, the difference between second and fourth in Iowa is nothing. I mean, it's meaningless.
I guess what I'm getting around to is Iowa's the only one that's the closest. Everything after Iowa is literally just not random, but it's going to be pretty out there. Right. If Buttigieg wins Iowa, could he run the table?
No.
Could he win
Not
South
Carolina?
Carolina? Okay.
Now, I guess, where do people fall on the question of whether or not this is your answer comes down to the effects of sequencing or the effects of the demographic composition of these electorates? It seems to me that Scott's sort of making the assumption that sequencing is playing a huge role here, and I probably am closer to Julian Castro's position, where the demographics here are kind of what's going to drive the major differences between, say, Iowa and New Hampshire and some of these other states. What does the desk think about kind of sequence versus demographics in answering that question?
So I'll take the first jab at it. I think sequencing is very important. One caveat being that Iowa and New Hampshire do like to sort of play spoiler on each other. So, the result of Iowa doesn't necessarily carry over into New Hampshire. But I do think that if Biden comes in fourth in Iowa, even if it's just by a couple percentage points, even if he's, let's call it 7 points behind the winner, I think the narrative around that is absolutely terrible for him, and that probably starts him on a death spiral. And so by the time that you get to South Carolina, there might be a candidate that is able to win over those voters that Biden currently has.
Right, that's the question, right? Does Warren or Buttigieg suddenly look more appealing, or Bernie Sanders suddenly look more appealing in South Carolina, just because Biden hasn't gotten good press out of those two races? And I agree. I mean, you can go back and look at 2008, which was a crazy year where Iowa was like, January 2nd or something. And it had been a back and forth in polling, between Clinton and Obama. Obama wins Iowa, and suddenly he shoots like a 20-point lead in South Carolina and never loses it. I'm just not sure that that's going to happen with whomever wins Iowa this year. The candidates, they're just not anywhere right now in South Carolina. And to think they're suddenly going to coalesce around this person because they won Iowa and New Hampshire, they're different voters, And Bernie Sanders complained about it in 2016. He's like, Hillary Clinton was picked by conservative Democrats. Well, sort of, yeah. Different world.
And they voted. Moving on to the endorsement tracker slide, Austin. It's interesting. I think there was just an endorsement today. Senator Harris got someone out of South Carolina, I think, but Joe Biden, 143 points endorsements. So this is all according to 538. Wow, John Delaney has 6 endorsements. Who endorsed John Delaney? Is he still running?
Maybe he had some friends.
John Delaney's still running. Okay, all right. Michael Bennett still running, has 5. I mean, here's the around the do endorsements matter? The age-old question: do endorsements matter? Pod cool.
Absolutely. I mean, it comes down to the weight, how much we say they matter, but we're definitely still living in a party decides world. We could say 2016 Republican was an outlier, but the 2016 Democrat went according to plan. So I just need to see some more evidence to grow the theory.
So just to argue there, Kamala Harris has 92 endorsement points, the second most endorsement points, but she is polling right around Andrew Yang, who is not on the endorsement tracker, by the way. Continued Yang media blackout. So how does that correlation square with your assessment?
I mean, if we look at the leader right now, it's kind of about who has the commanding lead, and Joe Biden's up hugely compared to some of these people, and based on our polling discussion that we just had, he seems pretty well situated. Maybe not the clear polling favorite, but I think there certainly is some correlation here. Yes, obviously, when you start looking at the second and third place people, those sorts of things matter. But also, I just don't know if the graphic that we're looking at right now, this just overall endorsements tracker, captures the nuances of how endorsements matter. I think dates matter. I think locations matter, and those sorts of things. But if we just kind of add them up together, maybe that's not telling the full story that we care about. But just because Kamala Harris is polling closer to Andrew Yang doesn't necessarily mean we need to throw out the idea that endorsements don't matter.
Well, are endorsements? What's the cause and effect relationship with endorsements? Do people do well because they get endorsements, or are they getting endorsements because they're thought they're going to do well if they're not necessarily in the polling? Right? I mean, these professional politicians, for the most part, being tracked, they have their finger on the pulse of this. They kind of see where they think is going to go, and they want to be on the train.
A bit of both, right? Because you have when you get endorsements, you get good press out of it, which in turn helps you. But also politicians, especially in such a crowded race like this one, they want to latch on to the winner. They want to latch on to someone who has a shot. So I think that's why, for instance, you have Pete Buttigieg recently has sort of seen an increase in the polling, but the endorsements are lagging that. He hasn't gained a lot of endorsements out of this yet. I think right now endorsements are kind of somewhat stalled in the sense that Democratic politicians across the country are sort of waiting and seeing who's legit and who's just a flavor of the month. Obviously, there's concerns about Biden. But there hasn't been a coalescing around any other candidate. There's been a little bit of a Warren bump, then now there's a little bit of a Buttigieg bump, but we don't know how real those are. My guess is that once the primaries start happening, then you'll see sort of more of a wave of endorsements once it becomes clear who can win and who doesn't really have a shot at winning.
And that goes back to the poll a little bit. Do we think Buttigieg is, he's the most recent one to get a bump? Do we think he's the last one? Can he ride this to February?
I think he peaked a little early. I think, whoever's the flavor of the month right before Iowa has a shot at winning. And then obviously the front runner, which I think you still have to call Joe Biden the front runner given the holistic national polling. I think that's what it is. I think he peaked 2 months too early.
So, final slide we're taking a look at before we kind of go into the next topic. These are, I guess, the most recent polls by state. The St. Anselm one is the one that everyone was talking about over the last 24, 48 hours that had Pete up 10. I think there's some questions about sample size and a couple other things, but it's a poll, so there's some data there. South Carolina, there's the plus 20 there. Biden plus 10 in Nevada, and then Buttigieg with the civics poll out of Iowa. Any final thoughts? I mean, it's kind of a good segue, as Al Dunson was saying, like, flavor of the month stuff. Our experience with Rubio was timing's everything. I mean, just ask Scott Walker, who was, the leader in June of 2015, or ask Rudy Giuliani, who was the leader in, fall of 2007. It's not about when you're the leader. It's about, when you're the leader. It is all about when you're the leader right before. I don't know. Any closing thoughts on how this is going to end up? What do you think, Jay Miles?
Oh, it's the bump for Mayor Pete in Iowa has definitely been something, and then but looking forward to South Carolina. I mean, if he keeps polling at 0% of the black vote, it's just hard long term to see how he gets it, and that's basically, I think, what we're seeing.
Final around the desk question is this decided at the convention or before the convention? Drew.
My head says before, but my chaos loving heart says at.
Podcool, what do you think?
Before, for sure.
Before? I also think before. Al Dunson.
I could be the contrarian. I think it's much more likely to be decided for, but I think that all the right ingredients for a contested convention are there. I don't know if that's enough to actually cause a contested convention, but I think the ingredients are there. I think some candidates are going to be selfish and stay in the race, kind of like in 2016 when that sort of happened, and it sort of caused some delegates to be sort of scattered around. Now, in 2016, that was not enough for a contested convention. There were only 3 candidates at the end, though. If you end up having a 4 or 5 person race, maybe. But I think much more likely to be before.
So you're
one last thought on that, though. One player that really hasn't entered the arena yet is Michael Bloomberg. I don't think he's the most popular guy in the world, but we're going to find out if $500 million can buy you some love, because he's going to spend it.
Well, and if $500 million doesn't buy you love, you can see if the next $500 million buys you some love. Jay Miles, though, what do you think? Before or at the convention, this will be decided?
I'm going to say before, but I do agree with who said that if it were going to be decided at the convention, the ingredients would be there.
Gotcha. All right, so moving on to the final segment. This is kind of what we've been talking about. We talked about it on previous streams, and we get in arguments in the office about it. Republicans lost in Kentucky, and Republicans lost in Louisiana at the statewide level, at the gubernatorial elections. There's a lot of minutia we can go into about, Matt Bevin losing the suburbs around Lexington and John Bel Edwards cleaning up in the suburbs where he needed to. Jay Miles talked about that a little bit. We'll go in here. But, does this mean if you're Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, you're worried about what's happening? If you look at what happened in Louisiana, is this the forecasting, the foreshadowing for, an even bigger blue wave into 2020? I mean, basically everyone's trying to figure it out. And we've got some people who have some different opinions on there. But let's start with this. Alex L. Dunson, make the case for, if you're a Republican, you look at what happened in Louisiana and you look at what happened in Kentucky, you should be worried.
So 2018 was a blowout year for Republicans in Congress. And I'll say Congress, including Senate, just because the Senate map was pretty stacked against Democrats. So if you're looking at 2020, what you're hoping is for the national environment to get better than that. And I don't think that any of these races tell you that the national environment is getting better. It's staying about the same, maybe slightly better than it was in 2018, but not really anything of note. You still have Democrats competing in races that are typically, Republican leaning. You still have the sort of urban and suburban rush away from the Republican Party, granted with a corresponding rural rush towards the Republican Party. And so if you're concerned about what happened in 2018, I don't see anything here that tells me that that is ending going into 2020.
All right, Alex Podcool, PhD, give us the counter argument.
I mean, there's some there's definitely interesting discussion on this question. I think there are maybe 2 points that I want to make in response to Al Dunson. The first is some of the gubernatorial election result outcomes in both Kentucky and Louisiana didn't even track with other statewide races that were happening concurrently on the ballots. On the screen right now, we have a map of the Kentucky governor election as well as the Kentucky Attorney General election. And here we see Matt Bevin totally underwater in way more counties than his Republican Attorney General candidate, Daniel Cameron. Especially in some of the eastern part of the state, we see that Cameron just outperformed Bevin. And we see a similar thing, and that was not only just Attorney General. On the same night that Bevin lost, Republicans had major wins for Treasurer, Auditor, Agriculture Commissioner, Secretary of State, and Attorney General. And we saw a similar pattern in Louisiana. So, Austin, if we could go to the next slide. Here we have just an outline of the precincts in Louisiana. This is just the election day vote. But comparing Risponi against the Republican Secretary of State candidate. So on the x-axis, we have the Secretary of State candidate's performance. On the y-axis, we have Risponi. Now, if it were a perfect alignment, we would see all those dots aligned on where that dark red line is at the 50, which is a slope of 1. But what we see here is that consistently in almost every single precinct across the state, Eddie Risponi was way underwater compared to his fellow Republican running for Secretary of State, which those two facts just seem to indicate to me just that maybe it was just the top of the ticket didn't perform that well, but other Republicans were. And then the second point that I want to make is rather minor, but just to respond to Alex, you're talking about kind of the national wins that are at play here, but these national wins happen within particular states. So you could look nationally and look at the unpopularity and the high unfavorables that are attached to President Trump. But according to our own exit poll in the state of Louisiana, we saw that Trump was doing very well in head-to-head matchups. He was up 20 against a generic Democrat. We saw his favorables through the roof. And so these national wins matter, but if we look at the voters' own perspectives on national politics in Louisiana, if I'm a national Republican in the state, I'm feeling pretty well.
So real quick, if we go to the final slide, to sum up everyone's arguments, I mean, Podcool basically says, look at the performance, look at the other Republicans running statewide in those states, and that's an example of highlighting the fact that these candidates, these Republican governors who lost, they lost because of them, not because of the national trend. And Alex L. Dunson's contention is this is just highlighting the effects that we're going to see in suburban and rural districts going into the 2020 election. I think this is a debate we're going to have pretty much up until about 1 a.m. the day after election when we have enough results back and we're looking enough at J. Miles maps to figure out whether or not President Trump lost some of these areas against, whichever Democratic candidate and maybe whichever Democratic candidate and independent candidate he's running against. So the people who weren't arguing today, Drew, real quick, yay or nay, what we saw in these two states is bad news for Republicans in 2020, or we should just take them by themselves?
I'm with Dr. Podcool on this one.
Dr. Podcool. Jay Miles, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if I were a Republican, I would still be feeling decently well. I mean, a perfect example of this would be in 2015 when Edwards won by 12 points. David Vitter the next day said that he would step down, and well, guess what? The next year, the Republicans had no problem holding a better seat in the Senate. So there's that. But I would say it probably could be better for Republicans in that, let's say, if Hillary Clinton were president right now, she would of course be in every ad. So, and they could have maybe even beat Edwards just on that. So, could it be better for Republicans? Yes, but I would still, I don't think Trump is in any position that he could lose Louisiana or Kentucky. So, on the whole, I think it doesn't. I wouldn't read too much into it.
Got it. I think we're all on the same page there. So we've eaten up a half an hour of time. This was an interesting experiment. Most of us were not as inebriated as we've been on election nights, so maybe we're less fun, right, Podcool? But thanks for listening. We'll do a little bit more of this as we're adding on more people and having more people like Miles on kind of break this down. Drew, anything else you want to close up with?
If you don't already get our newsletter, sign up for that at decisiondeskhq.com. Also, whatever stream you're liking on, follow us so you can get any updates and know when we're going to be on the air.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you all.